What does having children do to us? Why do we do it?
This is one of the reasons why I was interested in this topic as a psychological experience. It's like, wow, I'm learning more about who I actually am.
Why is there such a huge gap between what we think parenting will be and what it actually is? What are the jobs of mums and dads now? What's a dad now he's no longer just a provider?
The hypothesis was that kids had a lot of frightening experiences in childhood, like been exposed to heights or something, would have more anxiety. The opposite was true. The opposite, and this is again where dads come in. Dads challenge kids.
What's a mum now that she often is? Why, when we think having children will bring us closer together, does it so often push us apart? What am I supposed to teach or model for my children when I have no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years' time?
This wonderful analogy of an acorn with the imprint of an oak tree, and if it's allowed to unfold in more or less the right way, a particular oak tree will come into being.
Why did my parents have so much conviction about these things and I have absolutely none? Well, I don't know, but there are some really intelligent people all around the world who've been thinking about this stuff, and they are going to talk to me, and we might not answer all those questions every week, but if we listen to their ideas, maybe we can get some wisdom and some insight, and maybe most importantly, some perspective, and find out what it takes to be a happier parent. This week, I am speaking with Lisa Marchiano. Lisa is the author of Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself. She is also the co-host of my favorite podcast, This Jungian Life, where 3 Jungian analysts examine a variety of topics through a psychological lens. In her book and her podcast, Lisa has a real talent for making the beautiful yet very complex ideas of Carl Jung accessible. So we talk about the psychological journey of parenthood and the difference between the sacrifices which are required of mums and dads to go on that journey. We talk about how having children can help us connect better with our shadow side. We talk about our society's fixation on the good mother archetype, and Lisa feels we need a bit more of the good father in our lives, not just as parents, but as a culture. I love this episode. I still can't believe that I got to talk to Lisa, and I really hope that you enjoy it. I was first introduced to you through the podcast, This Jungian Life, and I was interested in Jung. I'd made some failed attempts to read Jung. And I think for anyone who's interested in psychology, they should look at Jung. But actually reading him in the original, there's some amazing ideas, but often at the expense of clarity. I found it really difficult. And your podcast was a great way of me getting into his ideas.
Well, that's really good to hear, because that is sort of that would be my wish for it. There are some really brilliant analysts who have written, books that are for a layperson and, kind of make these ideas accessible. And that's really what I hope to do, both with my books and with the podcast.
I'm not going to try and get you to explain Jung in a quick introduction. We're going to focus today on your book, Motherhood. I think the notion of individuation is really key to that book. Could you just explain individuation?
Okay. Well, I will give you the 30-second overview of Jung, if that's okay.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Jung he was a Swiss psychiatrist. He was born in 1875, and he eventually collaborated very closely with Sigmund Freud. So this was at the birth of psychoanalysis at the very beginning of the 20th century. They were close collaborators, and then Jung found that he had some very different ideas from Freud, and those ideas tended to be, in essence, what is the role of meaning and in essence kind of religion. So Freud said, absolutely stay away from that. The most important thing is to look at the sex drive as the kind of primary motivation that underlies all of human activity. And Jung said, I don't think that's exactly right. I think people also need meaning. So, and I'm collapsing this and kind of oversimplifying it, but he eventually published a book that said this, and he knew before he published that would be the end of his relationship with Freud, and it was. which then kind of cast him into this really great midlife depression. But in any case, that is one of his central ideas. I always say to when I'm talking about Jung, I'm always like, well, this is the big idea. No, this is the big, oh no, that's the big idea. But he has many, many big ideas which set his psychological beliefs apart. But one of them is that we are meaning-seeking creatures and that we really need meaning. And he saw that people's psychopathology, a lot of the symptoms, let's say, that he saw in his consulting room, he said existed because there was a lack of meaning. So individuation is, as you mentioned, kind of another critical idea. And individuation is this notion that we continue to develop psychologically throughout the lifespan. So Freud and the post-Freudians are mostly interested in what happens about birth through 5. So there are these kind of psychosexual stages of development that are kind of all sewn up in early childhood. And Jung, it's not that he wasn't interested in what happened in childhood, but he was much more interested in what happened kind of throughout the course of life. He's one of really only 2 psychoanalytic theorists who talked about growth throughout the lifespan. The other would be Erik Erikson with his psychosocial stages of development. But what Jung saw is that we spend the first half of life developing an ego. And an ego is your I. It's kind of what you think of when you think of, who am I? And the ego helps us navigate the outer world and the inner world. We develop a nice, strong ego, hopefully, through childhood and adolescence. We come to adulthood. And then we've got to get out in the world. We've got to, establish ourselves in a career, get a family, do those kinds of things. And then around about midlife, we often say, what am I doing this for? Where are my values? Am I sort of living life according to someone else's values? And that often kind of brings up a midlife crisis, which then can lead to the second half of life in which we turn inward and we're much more interested in kind of discovering what's unique about us. So individuation really kind of describes that whole arc. As you mentioned, Jung has a lot of beautiful ideas, but he was not particularly interested in being clear. He uses individuation in many different ways throughout the collected works. But in essence, it's this idea of becoming whom we were meant to be. So James Hillman, who was a Jungian thinker and writer, had this wonderful analogy of an acorn, and that every acorn falls off the tree with the imprint of an oak tree. And if it's allowed to unfold in more or less the right way, a particular oak tree will come into being. And that is this idea of our individuation. It's kind of our unfolding according to an inborn destiny. So yeah, that's a nutshell.
Well done.
I've had some practice.
Complicated stuff in there. I just want to jump in on something there that ties some of those things together with a question. This idea of meaning, this idea of midlife. And, my midlife crisis was literally bang on the door at 40 years old. But I had...
Right on time.
Right on time. So hello. The things that I thought worked aren't working anymore. And, but actually I had my children relatively young for this generation. My children were older then. But for a lot of people now, they're having children exactly at the same time as they're hitting this midlife point. And I think for a lot of them, the children then answer that meaning question completely, which feels a little bit dangerous. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking. Let me. I have to sort of talk that through because I think it can kind of work both ways. I mean, I definitely had my kids around that same time, and I wouldn't say they answered my meaning question. Of course, I was already in Jungian training, so maybe I'd already kind of done that. But what it did do was help me to see my mothering experience as part of my psychological development. And I mean, I don't know that made me a better mother, but it was helpful to me to understand it as such, to be able to kind of reflect on what was happening, which is really kind of where the book came from. But I think I do know some people who go all in on, the kids are basically, yeah, I think that may be happening. There's an American psychologist, Joshua Coleman. His whole focus is on family estrangement. And I know this is true in the UK as well as the US. The numbers of adult children estranging themselves from parents is on the increase. And Dr. Coleman, in his books, I think asks, why is this happening? And I think he does it with a great deal of sensitivity. Although I don't know that all parents would like the answer. But one of the points that he raises is when the whole meaning of your life is kind of put onto your relationship with your children, young people can really feel that as a heavy burden, and it can, it's like the more intensively we're parenting and, kind of crafting and curating the perfect childhood with all the experiences, which I did, absolutely, 100%. And, we're looking to our kids to provide this sense of meaning. That is a heavy, heavy burden. That's a heavy burden. Jung said the biggest impact, the biggest influence on the life of a child is the unlived life of the parent.
Yeah, that's the heading of one of your chapters, actually.
I think part of becoming an adult is being in service to someone or something else. And that's why, if we're having kids, when humanity, we used to have kids, which is young, we became an adult young because we were in service, we had to put ourselves in service to someone else. Having kids, I think, still does that. But I think we have to see it as something, again, yet larger than just the kids,
Yeah, a service to something outside of yourself that is, I mean, you talk in the later stages of the book that is actually about humanity moving forward as opposed to just your individual offspring.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so.
Connected to this idea of meaning and service, I think, is something to do with sacrifice and loss. And that the first part of your book is very much about loss. It's about the descent down the well, losing freedom, losing control, losing ourselves. The first three sections. Could you just talk briefly about myth and fairy tale and why we should care about them as adults?
So another one of Jung's big ideas is this notion of archetypes, which is a term probably most people have heard. Jung believed that we have a kind of psychological, psychic inheritance from the ancestors. So just the same way that we, all of our physiological structures are inherited through millions of years of evolution, we can trace ourselves back to our fish ancestors. He believed that we have a kind of similar psychic apparatus. So we have this legacy that we come into the world with, which means that we have kind of psychological universals pre-installed, that there are patterns before experience that we're kind of programmed to experience or to know. So one of those, for example, might be the Great Mother. Now, archetypes themselves don't have any form, but they tend to create the same images or similar images or stories in cultures all over the world. So Jungians are very interested in what we call archetypal material, and that would include religious imagery, myths, and fairy tales. So fairy tales are kind of like collective dreams. They're kind of product of the unconscious. And so we very much see that fairy tales contain universal patterns that can teach us about our own psychology. So some Jungians love fairy tales. I happen to be one of them. And I've always loved fairy tales. And now I have to say that fairy tales kind of help me think. So I don't think I could have written the book without fairy tales. But fairy tales are also beautiful and they're fun and they're fun to think about. So there's there's an aesthetic there as well, that they're just enjoyable.
I think they can be
Um,
quite hard to read, actually, given that we've become so married to a kind of like a feature film story with very specific rules to it. Fairy tales, when you try and read them to your children, Philip Pullman did a really good collection of all the Grimm ones. They go off on these tangents. They don't seem to end when you think they're going to end. There's like, you're like, hang on, is this a completely different story? They're not easy reading sometimes, despite being really fun.
some of them, it's interesting because some of them are tighter and have like a very what we would immediately recognize as a very kind of neat narrative structure, but some of them, I agree with you. Some of them are just kind of odd, and they're just like, oh, that's what we're doing. But I kind of love that about them because those are a little more rustic. But you can find plenty, I think, and I think most of the ones that I use in the book are kind of in that, the ones that we know really well,
Mm.
like Hansel and Gretel. It's like, oh, that hangs together,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and
The
and
ones
I
that have made it.
yeah, and I'm really fond of the ones that don't too, by the way, because I think it's interesting where they kind of veer off or whatever. But and by the way, the other thing about fairy tales is, even though they're so delicious in every way, they can be really dark.
Yeah.
There are some really dark tales. And by the way, just you didn't ask, but I'll say, I am utterly opposed to cleaning up fairy tales for kids. And I think that kids can hear even the most frightening tales at a very young age. I know some parents are like, "Oh, we're going to leave the part out where the wolf swallows grandma," and I'm not a fan of that. Let the wolf swallow grandma, because these stories are talking about psychological truths. And the thing that's the worst is to not have an image or a word or a story to give form to a fear. The worst fear is the unformed fear. And so it's actually very containing, I think, for kids to have an image of the fear that just lives inside them because we're human.
Mm.
It gives you a way to relate to it if you can tell a story about it. If you can tell a story about the troll under the bridge, that then you and I remember my son when he was little, he loved that story. The Three Billy Goats Gruff, which I had always hated, actually, because I thought it was just silly. And then I had to read it like 500 times, and of course I had to act it out. I had to clip clop clip, who's that tramping over my bridge, and all that stuff. And then we had to play this game where I was the troll and I was waiting around the corner and he would go over the bridge and I'd jump anyway. But that allowed him to kind of rehearse this drama of defeating the troll. So it was, which I think now, after reading it 500 times, I think I really understand that story very well. And it's about ego development. It's about, the first little billy goat is too tiny to do anything. But by the time the billy goat's a little bit older and bigger, he can defeat the troll. So, and that's exactly, it's a young child's story. Young children love that story. There's a few stories like that. I mean, I think The Three Little Pigs is one of them too. And again, they seem to me like the most insipid ones. At some point I was like, well, this isn't a beautiful, psychological tale. It's a very psychological tale, but it's about the early psychological task of developing an ego. Just I was just dense enough that I had to read it 500 times to realize that.
And reaching greener pastures as a result. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really, and it's
Mm-hmm.
so interesting that you picked, well, or your son picked this one for you, because on a previous interview I was talking to Dr. Emma Svanberg, who has a book called Parenting Humans, and she
Mm-hmm.
uses this analogy of the troll under the bridge
That's
to
interesting.
talk to adults about seeing the problem as something that's outside of themselves, to talk to couples about imagining a troll that's stopping them from meeting in the middle. So the fact that we all share in this imagery becomes
Yes.
really important. As you said,
Yes.
let's not hide the scary stuff from children. Humans need
Right.
these monsters, right?
Well, once something, and this was a real insight that Jung had. Once you can personify something, once it has a form, be it um, like a name, a label, an image, then you can have a relationship with it instead of being identified with it. So if you're a little boy and the world is scary, but now you have this image of the troll, then you can have an imaginative experience of defeating that troll, which is like a rehearsal you know, I don't know, dealing with your scary preschool teacher or the older boys who won't play with you or whatever it is. But you don't have words. You do not. Most of the, I mean, it's hard to find words for things. And even if you're an adult and you're in a marriage and the couple's having trouble, finding the words to describe what's going on, that's hard. Having an image that you can use imaginatively, is like it's like a really big step forward.
Just to explain the bit about having it as something outside of yourself as opposed to identifying with it.
I'll back into that by citing some research. Scientists who've studied emotion talk about the benefits of labeling. So in this one study, and of course I'm kind of doing this from memory, so I hope I don't get it too wrong, but they flashed like angry faces at people who were, test subjects. The faces went by so quickly that there wasn't even a conscious recognition of what they'd seen, but there was kind of like a stress response. Like you saw this really scary, angry face. You didn't even know you'd seen it.
Right.
But you registered a stress response. And then they did it again and they flashed the angry face and then they flashed the word anger. And the stress response calmed.
Right.
So, and we know this, right? You know that like when you're just, do you ever have that feeling where you're like just something, like you just feel like not right. You feel a little angry, you feel anxious, you feel something, and then you kind of go, wait a minute, what am I feeling angry about? Or what am I feeling anxious about? You think back and sometimes it's like a big deal, but sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, I forgot to do that thing. I have to remember to do that tomorrow. And like it goes down, or a lot of people say like if you're having trouble sleeping and you get woken up by thoughts, just write it down. Like, right? When we can label an emotional experience, it becomes more contained. So I think that that's what I'm talking about is when we don't have a way to give it a label or give it a shape or see it as something out there that we can have a conscious relationship with, then it's just rattling around in our psyche, it's rattling around in our body, and we can't have a conscious relationship with it. Whereas we can talk to it, we can think about it. If I have that feeling of dis-ease and I realize that I'm still angry at about a conversation I had with my spouse or something, I'd be like, oh yeah, I guess I'm still upset about that. And then while I'm going through my day, I can think about it. I have words for it now. It's like, yeah, I was really pissed off when he said that. I could journal about it later. I could call a friend and talk to it. Whereas if I don't label it, it's just rattling around causing symptoms, frankly.
Amazing. Let's talk then about this image of the descent down the well and what that means for you and what that means for mothers in the book. And then I'd like to talk about maybe how that might exist for fathers.
So Joseph Campbell has this beautiful book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in it, he lays out the hero's journey, which it's just such a fabulous book. He uses mythology from all over the world to kind of identify these typical stages of a hero's story. And there's a lot of discussion about, well, does that apply to women, or female heroines? Do they have a similar journey? And I think a lot of it does map on, but often in stories that feature a heroine, the journey first is down. So male heroes tend to go out and female heroines tend to go down. There's a lot of stories of a descent of one kind or another. So it's, in some ways it's not that dissimilar from what male heroes do. And it is related to what happens during rites of initiation. So there's kind of a separation, and then there's a time spent in the liminal place, and then there's a return. Those are the kind of classic 3 stages of any initiation. So I used that structure in motherhood, and I used the metaphor of the well because in many fairy tales, and in one in particular that I kind of tell in the beginning, there is a journey down a well, which I see as very much a journey to the inner world. But specifically, wells are, very feminine images. And what is the wisdom at the bottom of the well? It's often in mythology. It's a feminine wisdom.
The bit that is, I think, very specific to the maternal in the book is around loss. And I think there is a lot of, I don't know if you kind of are in the parenting conversation at all online, but there is a lot of anger towards dads from mums at the moment. And I think a lot of that is connected actually to the fact that men, unless they choose to, can become fathers without losing anything.
Yep.
Their careers, their personalities, their bodies
Mhm.
can all remain the same. But
Mhm.
this doesn't seem to be the case for mothers.
Well, I think it's true that men can do it without really having to give up much, of course. There's choices there because, a lot of dads that I know give up a lot. And sometimes I just want to say that I think that women, I understand it. Like, I remember when the kids were little, I remember one day my husband seemed like especially irritable. And I said, "Are you angry at me?" And he said, "No. I mean, I'm no more angry at you than I usually am." It's like baseline anger, And when you have little kids, you're constantly irritated with your spouse, right? I think
Yeah, and you're sleep deprived,
you're
and
sleep
yeah,
deprived.
there's no wins.
There's no wins. So I just want to say I can fully relate to feeling constantly sort of irritated, resentful, whatever. I felt it all. And I also know that I think it's easy for women to not see the cost to men, even if the man is just being the income earner outside the house. Because there's a way that being yoked to a career, I mean, it can be fulfilling. You get a lot of, let's say the person's I don't know, partner at a law firm. I mean, you get a lot of, attention. You have wonderful experiences. People admire you. You get paid really well, but it's
Status.
still status. But it still is a limiting experience. There's all kinds of things that man isn't doing. There's all kinds of dreams that man let die, and there's all kinds of experiences he isn't having. Often in service to the family, because I know men who have made the decision, I'm going to be the breadwinner so that I can have kids and my wife can stay home. And that is itself is a kind of service, and don't think that doesn't take a toll on the person who does it. So there's that. But, point is taken. I mean, men can literally become a father and, never see the kid and never, and that's not true for women because of the biology of it. It takes a toll on our bodies, an incredible toll, actually. It changes our bodies. It impacts a woman in some sense much more. And I do think that we are more aware of the losses. They hit us more acutely. We are often the ones who are doing more work. I mean, I think that's just true. I should say more of the childcare work. And there's the whole thing, which is, as far as I know, I think is true, that when both parents work outside the home, it's still the mom who does more. I think there's kind of data about that.
There is certainly data about that. Yeah, the double shift.
Yeah.
When I first read your book, I was like, hang on, there's some really big male journeys down, male
Yeah.
journeys to the underworld, right? And I
Yep.
immediately went to Odysseus and Aeneas. And what's interesting is the male
Hmm.
journey downwards requires a sacrifice for them to do it. And there's a difference, I think, between loss and sacrifice. A sacrifice
Mm-hmm.
is voluntary. It's like you choose
Yeah.
something
Yep.
important. This is always key. It's like go and get your best black ram or your best heifer. It's got to be valuable,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
If you want it to work, and
Yes.
you're gonna have to sacrifice this thing. I think what's interesting in what you just said, giving the example of the man who is a legal partner, it isn't the sacrifice of women or the loss. I mean, let's talk about which one it is. Um, is is completely connected to motherhood, whereas the sacrifice of men,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be work or war, which have always been men's two big ones, right? I'll
Yes.
give up my
Yes.
body to work, or I will lay down my life in a war.
Exactly.
Would happen with or without children. Now,
Yes, that's true.
I understand that we've got this thing around provider, but I feel a lot of the time for my mates, like they're like, oh, we have this thing we say, it's like everything I do is for my kid. I work for my kid. And I'm like,
Yeah, yeah.
you
Yeah.
had that job before you had a kid and you've always loved it.
Yep.
And are you telling me you do something completely different? So I think it's really complicated, that
Yeah.
relationship.
No, I appreciate that. You're right. I like that. It would, work in war and it would happen with or without kids. And I don't know. I mean, you know, uh, it maybe I'm wrong about this. I didn't write a book about fatherhood because I don't know that experience from the inside, but it seems like it does seem like men are more limited in what they might choose to do because they're thinking of this provider role. But I appreciate what you're saying about Odysseus. I mean, the thing is that those kinds of journeys to the underworld that we find in mythology are usually to seek knowledge,
Hmm.
to gain some. So there's a specific, and you're right, it's like chosen, and you have to make the sacrifice, and it's kind of time limited, and it's a descent to understand something, to be granted a boon. It's interesting because I think of one of the descents that I talk about in the book is the fairy tale Vasilisa the Beautiful. She's not literally going down, but she's going into the forest,
Right.
and
Into the
she,
darkness. And
into the
yeah.
darkness. There are Russian fairy tale heroes who also visit Baba Yaga, but again, it's done to seek gnosis. It's done to seek protection, and there's like a sacrifice first. He has to prepare himself to experience this. He goes, and then he gets the boon and he leaves. It isn't quite the same thing as, hey, you just have to
Mm.
go and see what happens. It's like
And
he's going with an
what I'm
ask.
thinking about the journey down the well, this is really interesting, right? Because the journey down the well for women, or in Beautiful, what's the Russian name?
Vasilisa the Beautiful.
These characters are forced, right?
Exactly.
They're thrown
Exactly.
down the well, which
They're
is really
thrown.
interesting when you look at
Hmm.
pregnancy and giving birth. There's no options there to women. It's like
No.
you're going to change. Your brain's going to change shape. Your body's going to change. There will be loss. Things will be taken
Yeah.
from you. Whereas
Yeah.
whereas for fathers, there has to be a sacrifice. If you want to make that
Hmm.
journey inwards down, if you want to come back with the new whatever, then you have to
Hmm.
choose to give something up. And I think one of the things that is quite hard in the culture at the moment is that as women have become great breadwinners,
Yeah.
men aren't quite sure what their sacrifice is supposed to be anymore. And actually, we're being asked now to make this kind of new sacrifice again. It is still a sacrifice, as in it's by choice, and engage in the domestic sphere and engage in caregiving in a
Hmm.
completely different way.
Hmm.
And I think there's a kind of tension there. And I
Yeah,
think,
there is. And I think it goes back to this question of meaning. Like, how do you understand meaning? I mean, being the person who, sacrifices his body for work, for example, can feel very meaningful to some men. Whereas, staying home and making raisin faces in the oatmeal maybe doesn't. I mean, I know that often doesn't feel particularly meaningful to women either. But do you see it? So does becoming a caregiver become meaningful and part of a father's psychological development? That very much could be a legitimate, worthy journey. But if the father doesn't relate to it that way, then yes, I think there can be a feeling of I'm irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean that is 100% what my experience has been. That it has been a massive kind of part of my
Mhm.
journey, and it has split me wide open. And the second part of your book about relation with you don't use the word shadow, darkness. You use the word darkness. I found that to be not exclusively maternal.
Yeah,
I
yeah, I would
I
imagine.
yes. So maybe, yeah, could you just talk to us a little bit about shadow before we kind of discuss
Mhm.
those things?
Yeah, so shadow is another one of Jung's key ideas. It's very much in the culture now, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it. Shadow are those aspects of ourselves we'd rather not know about. There are things that are often not valued by the culture, by our caregivers, so aspects of ourselves that we've learned to kind of push aside and not identify with. So, it might be, I mean, I like to say, there's the obvious ones like don't be greedy, right? So your greed is in the shadow, and it's like, oh no, I'm not greedy. But yet, you'll be the first one at the buffet table or whatever, it's there. You've just disidentified yourself from it. We tend to project shadow. We might see it in other people while denying that we have it ourselves. Um, but the other thing about shadow is, I'll often say to people, usually in your family of origin, there was one thing you weren't allowed to be. If you look at sort of the values of the family, it's like, well, we the Marchianos, we're hardworking, or we're very philanthropic, or whatever it is. What it was, and that means you can't be lazy, you can't be selfish. What is that thing that was like, oh no, not in this family, we're not that. That's probably in your shadow.
And I think that's really interesting about the shadow. I think people obviously often misunderstand it as things that are bad. It's not things that
Right.
are bad. It's things that you're not allowed to be. So what was really interesting in the book was that you started talking about the way that we project shadow onto our children.
Hmm.
And that was a real eye opener for me. And I was, yeah, not in a nice way. I was like,
I know.
oh my God, that is exactly what I'm doing.
Well, I think one of my favorite epigraphs in the book, and it just like captures so much about this conversation about like shadow and anger and everything, is by the novelist Faye Weldon said, the best thing about not having children is you can go on believing that you're a good person.
Yeah.
So, it's like children actually will bring out the worst in us for sure. At one point or another, you will know the very worst of yourself, and you will be shocked. You'll be shocked that you could have such hideous, heinous, sadistic, cruel thoughts about the person that you love most in the whole world. I mean, that was very much my experience. Like, whoa, I didn't know that was there, but there it was. So, this is one of the reasons why I was interested in this topic as a psychological experience. It's like, wow, I'm learning more about who I actually am. And I don't know that I would have learned that about myself. And, Jungian way of understanding things is that kind of the whole point is to learn as much about yourself as you can. And so, oh, that's interesting. That's good. So now in terms of projection, so we can project the least liked parts of ourselves on our kids. And then they just really bother us and they get under our skin. So let's say that we struggle a little bit socially. Let's say we're a little shy. We've always had a hard time making friends. We've done our best to overcome it. We get along just fine. And then we have a kid and we take that baby to the playgroup. And all of the other babies get off their parents' lap and are crawling around on the floor. But this little baby just sits on your lap and won't get off the floor and is scared. And as the kid gets older, he's very shy. He clings to your skirt when you try to drop him off at preschool. He, cries easily and isn't making friends. And you're like, oh, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. You just hate that about him. You hate that about him. You try to have empathy with it, but it just irritates you so much. And if you think about why it irritates you so much, it's like, oh, that's this thing I hate about myself. And it's inevitably going to happen, right? Because I mean, our kids are, you know, especially if they're biological, they're likely to have some of the same weaknesses we have.
And it's also so understandable in a way because you've moved that element into your own shadow, you've
Yeah.
buried it, right? Because it wasn't
Yes,
allowed. You're not
exactly.
allowed to be that. Like,
Yes.
I, like
Yes,
you, trippiers are hardworking and we're also brave. And one of my
yes.
sons, it used to be quite a scaredy cat, and it used to
Hmm.
drive me up the wall because,
Yep.
but actually, that's a huge part of me. That those
Yeah, you're
things,
not allowed to be, you're not
no, you're
allowed to
not allowed
be,
to be. It's
yeah.
it's banned. How dare
Hmm.
you?
Hmm. So then it
I,
has all this energy when you see it in your kid.
yeah, yeah. But then the growth you come up with, you bring out this Jung quote in there that actually 90% of the shadow is pure gold.
Hmm.
The growth that comes from that realization, and also for me, the ability to talk to that side of myself with the
Right.
same voice that I would use with my child.
Right.
It's so I've got goosebumps thinking about it now. It's
Yeah, yeah,
it's kind
yeah.
of it's a wonderful experience to go
Well,
through.
so when you see it in your kid, it gets surfaced and you may want to like throttle your kid, you know, or it may really drive you crazy. But if you can get conscious about it and say, oh, that's mine too, it does invite this greater compassion. Because of course, even if it irritates you, you try to treat your kid as compassionately as possible in the midst of that, which then invites, like you're saying, it invites greater self-compassion, and you understand it from the outside in a way you didn't understand it before. And then the other thing is that sometimes there's a shadow character that's been banned, but like you say, it's pure gold. And then you see your kid living that out, and you're like, oh my God, I've been thinking that was a terrible quality, but actually it's an incredible quality. What a strength. I didn't even realize that was a strength before now, you know. And the example I give in my book is that you know, there was a certain kind of injunction in my upbringing to be I don't know, just not be the center of attention. Just don't you know, don't be an attention hog. And my son as a toddler was quite like super outgoing and kind of the center of attention a lot of times in a way that, you know, sometimes was obnoxious, but it really worked for him. You know, like kids really liked him, and he was just so comfortable being the center of attention. And I could watch that and sort of like cringe, but then also go like, oh my God, that's amazing. You know, look at that. Like what would happen if I like
Mm.
cultivated, like what would happen if I developed a relationship with that part of myself that has heretofore been banned, you know?
I wanted to talk a little bit about rage.
Mhm.
It's a very powerful um, theme in your book. I think part of the gentle parenting movement that is we're trying to correct for something that actually in the whole culture, not just parenting, we've realized isn't great. Even in the workplace, we've realized
Mhm.
that getting people to do things, the best way to do that isn't by threatening and shouting.
Sure.
And we want to change. We want to change those tools. But what you talk about in your book is when anger isn't allowed as an
Yes.
emotion in the
Mhm.
home. And I think that's the danger I see of gentle parenting is that obviously it's still there, but
Right.
it becomes hidden. And kids, particularly non-verbal kids, they know it's there. Like
Mhm.
maybe the other day, my boys were about to. I've got a girl and two boys. And my boys were about to have an argument, and I was two rooms away. And I ran into the room and was like, oi, just whatever it is, stop it. I couldn't hear any words.
Yeah.
But something had
Oh
changed,
yeah.
right? And
Yeah,
it must
yeah.
be exactly the same the other way around. So just
Right.
because we're speaking to each other in sing-song voices, darling, like, what
Right,
is
right,
that if you're a kid, right? So I'd
right.
really like to hear your thoughts and your problems with gentle parenting, if
Hmm.
you don't
Hmm.
mind.
Sure. I think that our culture, look, we need in the workplace, in our lives, and parenting, we need the archetypal good mother, but we also need the archetypal good father. And the archetypal good mother is, is soothing and loving and nurturing and giving. And um, the archetypal good father is sets rules and creates expectations and creates boundaries. And that isn't necessarily warm and fuzzy. It doesn't have to be, cruel and blasting someone with an angry voice, but it's not always about making someone feel good.
Would you say he pushes towards risk as well a bit, is the other thing I think of
Yes,
as
definitely.
father?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and that's right. And there's all this like great research about what mothers do versus what fathers do and why fathers are so important. Some of the research is that mothers tend to get down on the level of the kid and talk to them in a soft voice and, change their vocabulary so that it's more kid friendly. And dads don't do any of that. So that and it's like a kid needs both, right? A kid needs this kind of soft place to understand, and then the dad is like, nope, you're gonna, you need to adapt. You need to adapt to me. I can remember when my kids were little. I would be like, okay, I have the kids today. What do they want to do? What would they like to do? Well, gee, they might like to go to the zoo. So I'll take them to the zoo. Whereas, my husband would be like, if I left him with the kids, he'd be like, what do I need to do today? I need to go to Home Depot. The kids are coming with me to Home Depot and they damn well better like it. So, and it used to annoy me, and I've heard other women complain about it. And now I'm like, oh no, that's just a dad thing. Like the kid, if you're a kid with dad, you've just got to adapt and do what dad wants. It's like mom is all about, let me do what you want, sweetheart. And dad's like, come, you're coming with me, get in the car. These two principles ask different things of kids. And I think in some ways, we're creating a culture of only good mother so that no one should ever feel any discomfort. Society is there to meet all of our needs. Other people need to make sure that they are taking our comfort in account first and foremost. Otherwise, it's literal violence or whatever. Some of these kind of cultural trends, we have to put trigger warnings on things. God forbid anyone should ever feel uncomfortable. And I think you're right. I think, the gentle parenting movement, which creates other tools for, say, setting limits or communicating expectations, is comes from a good place and is positive. And I think it's the more extreme things where we literally get into a mindset where this child should never feel uncomfortable or challenged. That's not good for kids, and it's not good for our culture either. And dads are usually the ones who challenge.
I think before the female listeners get absolutely furious with that,
Oh no.
hang on, so dad gets to do whatever he wants and I have to think of the kid. The point of these archetypes actually is that anyone can access them. So that
Yeah.
actually
Yes.
you possibly more difficult to access, but
Yes.
actually fathers can now access that good mother stuff. But actually
Yes.
mums should also be accessing no, I'm gonna
Yep.
there's
Yes.
something in that
Exactly.
about a push towards adulthood, I think,
Yeah.
which is
Hmm.
uncomfortable.
I'll say I think a lot of women who, in my cohort of mothers, we weren't so much the gentle parenting, we were the attachment parenters. And, child led this and child led that. And a lot of it was really beautiful and some of it was ill-advised. And I think that frankly, I'm now seeing a lot of kids around the age of my kids who are a little bit fragile because we coddled them. And I think it's something that happened at an individual level, but also like on a cultural level. So even if you were a mother who didn't necessarily coddle, but your kids came up in a coddling environment where schools were like, oh, you feel anxious, well, you can go to the nurse's office. Well, that's the exact wrong thing to do with anxiety. We've got to challenge anxiety. But as a culture, we're like, oh, we want you to feel safe. We want you to feel comfortable. We're like, too much good mother. So I think both mothers and fathers need to access some of that good father energy too. And, as you're saying, fathers can access the good mother energy and maybe like occasionally take the kid to the zoo instead of Home Depot.
When my wife, obviously, I have loads of conversations around all these things about insane expectations on the mother rather than the father, and how low the bar is for us to be good dads. She says, the final kick in the teeth for mums is that we're the ones who get bitched about all the time in therapy.
There's this interesting conversation going on between the attachment theorists and people who look at kind of the genetic basis for psychological disease, for example, for symptoms, because it's not always just that your mother didn't do A, B, or C, and usually it is the mother who
Are we talking about a nurture versus nature debate?
Kind of, yeah.
Right.
Yes,
Is it? Yes. Was that going to happen anyway?
Look, it's always a complex interplay, but nature's definitely in there.
Yeah.
And I think I'm also really interested in that because I've seen people. It's such a complex interplay. But when you're a therapist and you've seen people come in with fairly severe symptoms, like acting out and doing things that are not healthy, and you comb back through the personal story, and there was maybe a difficult divorce, and maybe dad had a kind of hair trigger anger, and maybe mom was sometimes a little depressed or something, but there's no like major, there's nothing. It's like you can't be like, oh well, that explains everything, that explains why you're drinking now, or why you have an eating disorder, that, oh, we got it, but then the next hour comes in, and this person was sexually abused, and was abandoned by their parent, and they had a parent who was incarcerated, or you name it, adverse childhood experiences all the way down the line, and that person is functioning really well. You're like, there's this is not this.
I feel like we're back to the acorn.
Yeah, we are. In part, I think we're back to the acorn. Obviously, parenting is in there, but it's also probably in there in a way that's very complex, that we can't say, well, if I just gentle parent my kids, then they will grow up to be successful and happy. It's like, it's not.
Yeah, and I think
there's something mysterious.
What's really interesting, I think, is that when you have more than one child, it's when the second child comes and you're like, hi, like, oh, there is a finite amount I can do here. You're you. And oh my God, no, you're you,
Yes.
And I work with really young children, and they are people from very early. They're very different people. And there's two things I want to talk about there. One is like individuation, and what can we as parents do, to give our child a freer path to do that. And then I guess the other point there is about the transcendent, because I think there is something that happens when you realize that this child is just much more than the sum of its parents. There is a link with the divine, and it's huge.
The first task of individuation, like I said at the beginning, is to get yourself an ego and get out in the world. And I think that most of us as parents are very focused on helping kids do that. We want to get them set up to get educated and get a career. And in some sense, that's an important part of individuation. Someone asked me once, so should I be doing shadow work with teens? And I was like, no, because they're actually in the process of ego formation, or development, let's say. And part of ego development is figuring out what you're going to put in the shadow. It's not a conscious decision.
No,
but you're like,
going on.
Okay, right. I've got to take my predilection for, sitting and watching Netflix for 20 hours a day and put that in the shadow like that. I have to ban that, to use your word, I have to ban that. So no, it's like, you don't want to not have a shadow. You've got to have a shadow. So you don't want to be like, oh, I don't want my kid to have a shadow. So I would say the one thing I would say to kind of help a kid with individuation is that kids do need to learn resilience. And if we don't, if we make life too easy for them, if we clear the way, then they don't get that. So they have to, the first half of life is the hero's journey, and they need to have a kind of heroic attitude and heroic ego. They need to be able to go fight those trolls under the bridge. And that means that we can't do it for them, you know?
So we can give them the confidence to go out and do that, but what we can't do is defeat the troll for them. They have to go
and
in.
I would say we can't give them the confidence, but if we give them the opportunity to try to defeat some trolls, then they may gain that confidence.
Right. Yes.
So
Okay.
in some sense, it's not, it's like, so there was some research done about like childhood anxiety, and the hypothesis was that kids had a lot of frightening experiences in childhood, like say had, been exposed to heights or something, would have more anxiety. The opposite was true. The opposite. And this is again where dads come in. Dads, challenge kids. It's like, oh, you had a fight with Johnny because he took your toy. Here, go tell Johnny you want your toy back, not doing it for them. Or the tickling, the roughhousing that dads do, that is so incredibly important. And roughhousing, I mean, I know like this happened in my house all the time. I bet it happens in yours. It's all laughs. It's all fun. It's tickles and games until it's not. And it ends with someone crying, always.
Yeah, always. Yeah.
Right?
Otherwise, why would you stop? Because it's brilliant until someone cries. That's the bell.
But that's the important experience, is you take the kid right up to their edge. And dads do this better than moms in general. I mean, moms of course can do it, but it just comes more naturally to dads. And then I loved what you said about transcendence.
The transcendent, I'm sorry, I'm burning up your time here. I will let you go, but I'm loving this conversation so much. I know you're a big Ian McGilchrist fan.
I am.
And one of the things he says is that we've become intellectually impoverished, morally bankrupt, and spiritually dead. And
sounds about right.
He doesn't mess around, does he? But I was a complete atheist, and then I had Lila, and I was like, I felt really compelled to go to church, and I didn't actually enjoy it at all, and I didn't have a great experience. But I guess what I'm saying is, has our experience of having children, some of us, I mean, it's become our only experience with the transcendent.
Well, I mean, and again, this kind of goes back to your thing about like if your kids become your only source of meaning or transcendence, then that's not good. But I do think the kids can open us up to something transcendent. And actually, I think that is pretty much my favorite chapter in the book, because I have a chapter about that it does open you up to the transpersonal. It opens you up to something beyond yourself. Hopefully you don't, there's that Zen koan, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, which I think, and I've never consulted a Zen master about this, but I've always understood that to be like, if meaning gets fixed in something, then it's dead and it's lost the meaning. Right. So it's kind of like that. It's like if you found meaning through parenting or through raising children, then, I mean, yes, raising children is just inherently meaningful, by the way. I mean, it just is. But don't let that become your God, because then it will immediately get is sort of overfreighted, and the experience is the experience of connection with the divine or the transpersonal. It's not about the thing. So you just have to carry that forward.
I really hope you enjoyed listening to that. Now you've finished listening, go and listen to the This Jungian Life podcast. It's the best podcast. Lisa's books are Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, and The Vital Spark, Reclaiming Your Feminine Fire. You can now find Be a Happier Parent on Substack, where I'm trying to summarize some of the things I'm learning doing the podcast in writing. Please follow us on Instagram or TikTok, and full episodes are available with video on my YouTube channel, Alexindadland. Thanks for listening. I hope to see you all next week.